3 disappearances. 3 small, stubborn clues that refused to add up. A 2-word text sent from a place she had no reason to be. A body left in an apartment that neighbors assumed was empty. Letters that claimed a stolen childhood and then went silent. Each case could stand alone as a mystery. Together, they sketch a darker pattern: how tiny anomalies, institutional blind spots, and unanswered calls can become the long shadows that haunt families for decades. We begin in Germany, in June 2006. Then we cross to Zagreb, where a woman vanished from social life, only to be found decades later in her own flat. Finally, we travel back to the United States, to a Montana picnic where a 4-year-old vanished and anonymous correspondence would later twist grief into new uncertainty. These are the stories that follow. Sources and a fuller timeline are listed in the description below. If anything in what we say here sounds familiar or prompts questions, you'll find the references there. Our first case opens on a summer night and a public square full of celebration. The World Cup had filled local pubs with people watching the match and cheering at every possession. In that small crowd was a young student nurse, a woman working her way through training, known to friends and family as steady and practical. She spent the evening with her mother and other people from her life. Later she left the pub alone, as she often did after a late shift or a night out. She should have been home within minutes. What happened next is the kind of timeline that makes sense until it doesn't. She left the pub. She never reached her apartment. A few hours later, a brief cryptic message arrived on a phone that still clung to faint signals. 2 words, sent from a town listed in some records as indefinido. The message itself was not a confession or a location. It read like someone closing an ordinary conversation. For investigators, that text became a focal point. For the family, it was a last thread to hold. Her cell phone data records paint a confusing picture. Early that evening, the device pinged in predictable places. The pub, a route toward her neighborhood. But then the pings jump, sometimes to industrial zones on the town's outskirts, sometimes to areas where cell towers overlapped in ways that made precise location difficult. Over the next week, the phone would call one person in particular, an ex-partner. The calls were terse. He would later tell police that she answered one call with a clipped yes. On the same call, later in the exchange, she answered no. The tape is short. The clip of her voice on that recording turned into an emblem for investigators and family alike. Ambiguous, haunting, a hint that someone was on the line but not free to say what was happening. In the end, skeletalized remains were found months later. The discovery was clinical in the accounts available to us. Remains consistent with a person of her build and some clothing fragments that matched what she had been last seen wearing. Personal items were missing. At the scene, investigators noted the presence of a small cross that did not belong to her usual jewelry. An unfamiliar object placed near the remains in a way that suggested someone else had been there. That cross, like the 2-word text and the phone pings, became a tiny, stubborn symbol in the case, meaningful in ways that were never fully explained. From the beginning, the investigation moved in crowded, sometimes contradictory directions. Hundreds of interviews were logged. Neighbors, friends, bar staff, drivers, and strangers who'd been in the area were questioned. Suspicions were raised, then softened. Leads were followed, then stalled. The ex who'd received the calls cooperated. He described the strange cadence of those final exchanges but could offer nothing decisive. The forensic picture was limited, as it so often is when time has its way with evidence. Decomposition had reduced the body to bone and fragment, narrowing the range of what could be reconstructed. Blood traces, DNA in soft tissues, and the kind of microscopic transfer that sometimes provides a breakthrough were not available in the way investigators need them to be definitive. Still, the phone records beckoned like a map with missing coordinates. The pattern of pings suggested movement. But movement of what? A person forced along different roads? A phone passed between places to mislead attention? A staged trail intended to send searchers spinning toward industrial zones while the true location remained hidden? Investigators considered each option, weighing the practicalities of each scenario against the known geography of the area and the rhythms of cell coverage. Experts in telecom forensics noted that pings bouncing between certain towers can be explainable by simple network behavior. Others argued that the pattern was too consistent to be accidental. The truth refused to yield. One line of theory suggested that calls and texts were supervised, arranged by someone monitoring and controlling what the victim could say. In the recorded yes and no exchange, listeners have argued over whether the woman was answering questions under duress, or whether background noise masked another voice giving commands. But the recordings do not resolve motive. They do not identify an abductor. They do not provide a suspect with corroborated evidence that would stand in court. They do what evidence often does in cold cases. They point, they imply, they demand interpretation. Other evidence raised softer but no less painful questions. Personal belongings were missing when the remains were recovered. Some items that usually travel with a young woman, keepsakes, photographs, jewelry, were not present. That absence prompted multiple theories. Had items been taken as trophies? Had they been removed earlier to misdirect? Were they simply lost to time and scavengers? In a case stalled by time and environmental degradation, missing possession becomes a vacuum that attracts speculation. Family members did what families do in the absence of answers. They turned grief into a search. A mother launched a website, an online memorial, and a living archive that cataloged timelines, press clippings, and photographs. For years, that site served both as a vigil and a repository for tips. It was updated slowly, with the kind of careful restraint that comes from a long, painful familiarity with the rise and fall of hopeful leads. When we speak of the human toll in this case, what follows metrics and police reports is simple but devastating. Life rearranged around questions that have no end. There are practical reasons to respect the case's uncertainty. Names of towns in early police logs appear inconsistently in the records we could consult. Transcriptions we received showed place names with multiple spellings. When a report lists a town as indefinido in one sheet and something else in another, production must flag those discrepancies rather than offer certainty where there is none. That is why, in discussion of locations beyond the broad setting of Germany, we use indefinido for specifics that remain unverified. The case also forces a reflection on modern evidence. What happens when a phone is both lifeline and misdirection? Cell towers do not lie, but their readings can be hard to read. The shape of a signal can be bent by terrain, by industrial interference, by the mere movement of the device. In this investigation, every technical detail that seemed promising also revealed how fragile our faith in data can be. Even as we built timelines from pings and call logs, we had to remind ourselves that the map we drew was, at best, a probable route. And probabilities do not always help a family sleep. Investigators considered the possibility of a dump site versus a holding site. If she had been killed elsewhere and moved, the choice of location, on the edge of a quiet field or in a place that made detection unlikely, could speak to knowledge of the area or cruelty that sought to erase. If, by contrast, she had been held briefly somewhere and the phone used then discarded, that too suggested a different operational pattern by whoever took her. Both permutations hint at planning. Both leave gaps. The community reaction was immediate and textured. Local news covered searches with the dignified urgency that such stories demand. Neighborhood volunteers combed hedgerows. A social media presence that would now be expected for the case barely existed in 2006. The family's website filled some of that gap, collecting reflections from friends and cryptic tips from strangers. Some tips turned out to be dead ends. Some were simply the echoes of well-meaning confusion. Over time, the public intensity waned, but for the family, the case never closed. What looks to an outsider like a file labeled cold represents a set of daily rituals for those who lived through the disappearance. Anniversaries marked in silence, rooms kept as memory, the slow recalibration of hope. For prosecutors and detectives, the missing link was always the same: an absence of admissible evidence tying a person to the disappearance beyond reasonable doubt. The police reports show a methodical approach: interviews documented, leads prioritized, Forensic tests ordered where possible. Yet time is an adversary. It degrades, it obscures, it erodes. Decomposition limited what could be gleaned from remains. The lack of eyewitness testimony placing a suspect with the victim during the critical window hamstrung efforts. And in the absence of a reliable confession or a witness with independently verifiable corroboration, the legal system has little to progress on. Still, the small cross found near the scene remains a symbol that refuses to be quiet. It is a kind of material residue that, in later accounts, family members return to over and over. Was it a personal item of the victim that had been moved? Was it placed there by someone who wanted to send a message, or by someone who had found the remains earlier and intended to leave a sign? Investigators logged the cross as an item of interest, but cautioned against reading too much into positional evidence without corroboration. For families, however, objects accumulate meaning in ways that formal reports cannot capture. A simple cross becomes sacred and suspect simultaneously. We wrestle with another ethical dimension in casework like this: how to speak about the living without reducing them to their last known moments. The student nurse was more than a person on a missing poster. Friends remember practical jokes she played in study groups, small acts of care in the hospital wards where she trained, plans she had sketched out for a life of work and quiet pleasures. That human texture resists the cold lines of police files. It compels those of us recounting such stories to keep dignity at the center, even as we pursue details that might yield answers. As the months passed without closure, the family kept channels open. They accepted interview requests with caution. They posted updates that read like a ledger of persistent grief, anniversaries of absence, appeals for information, the occasional new sighting that would flare into short-lived hope. The way a family structures its public remembrance is both survival and strategy. The website became a place to log time, to remind the community not to forget, to show that a missing person has not simply been reclassified as history. Investigators never stopped returning to the two-word text and the phone's odd path. Telecom experts who reviewed the records described the patterns as suggestive, but stopped short of definitive conclusions. A common refrain in the files is worth noting. Something that appears anomalous in the data can, under further scrutiny, be explained by mundane network behavior. But the other refrain is equally present. Mundane explanations do not always satisfy the emotional need for narrative closure. We are left, in this case, with a lattice of plausible scenarios, and no single thread that ties them into a factual narrative. What can we learn from this first story then? One lesson is the fragility of certainty. Another is how burdened investigation becomes when evidence is both scarce and symbolically charged. A two-word text, a small cross, a clipped yes, followed by no, these are not crimes. They are traces. They beg interpretation, and in their ambiguity they sometimes expose systemic weaknesses, limits in forensic reach, limits in eyewitness reliability, limits in how a community notices when someone drifts away from the circle of attention. As we leave this case behind, not because it is resolved, but because we must continue our work, we should hold to the humanity at its center. The woman who vanished in June 2006 was a nurse, a daughter, a friend. For those who loved her, the record is not merely an unsolved file. It's a life interrupted. Our recounting must honor that gap, rather than fill it with unfounded conclusions. From a moving phone mystery to a corpse that seemed to close a room around itself, the next case shifts the stage to the Eastern European city of Zagreb, where social systems and silent corridors of bureaucracy would play a central role. There, an elderly woman living alone faded from public life in a way neighbors say they noticed only in hindsight. In a building sustained by state tenancy rules and the routines of apartment blocks, she slipped into absence while bills were handled by others and notices gathered dust. When the flat was finally opened decades later, what officials found would raise uncomfortable questions about communal responsibility and administrative anomalies that read like small, dark secrets. Her name in some sources appears as Hedviga. In others the spelling is recorded differently, and in places as indefinido. The exact timeline of when she was last seen in public and when she was assumed absent varies between documents. Those discrepancies are worth emphasizing because they point to how easily loneliness can become paperwork. Her neighbors described a woman who kept to herself. She did not fit the profile of someone the entire community would watch, and in a building where many people pass through without interacting, absence can go unnoticed for months, sometimes for years. The mechanism of social neglect in this case is not a dramatic single act. It is a series of small omissions. Meals not delivered, calls unanswered, visits that cease. Neighbors later told investigators that they assumed she had moved away or gone to stay with relatives. Doors closed and opened without attention. Administrative processes, census checks, tenancy lists, notices slid like bureaucratic papers over a life until the life itself was no longer visible on any grid. The flat remained assigned in municipal records, at times clearing back to an architect's name that appears repeatedly in payment logs for utilities. Decades of paid electricity bills, marked in records as handled by an unexpected third party, created another small, durable puzzle that would later look like a shadow of something hidden. When municipal authorities finally gained entry, sometime years after Hedviga had not been seen, the body was found in a state of remarkable preservation relative to the time that had passed. Reports described the scene in restrained terms. The woman appeared to have been in her armchair, a cup nearby, as if she had simply not risen. Windows were partly open. Personal effects remained in place. The condition suggested that she had died in the flat and gone unnoticed for a long period. For neighbors and investigators alike, the question was not simply how she had died, but how an occupied apartment could coexist with life elsewhere in the building and in municipal oversight. Administrative anomalies multiplied the mystery. A census notice found on the door had not been logged in the usual commission records, according to officials who later reviewed the paperwork. Payments for electricity listed an architect's name over many years, a person who, when contacted, offered a variety of explanations that did not clarify why his name appeared on bills for the flat. Eviction and clearance procedures that typically trigger cross-checks had not occurred in this case. For some officers, these facts suggested a confluence of wartime disruptions, clerical oversight, and perhaps the misapplied discretion of individuals who thought they were doing someone a kindness by not reporting an absence. For others, the pattern raised the possibility of deliberate concealment, an uncomfortable line of thought that could not be pursued without evidence. Neighbors gave mixed accounts. Some remembered seeing her on the landing in the late 1960s and 1970s, then not again. Others recalled hearing television through the walls in the early 1980s. Memory in these stories is both a resource and a hazard. Decades of recollection can blend with the desire to be helpful. What emerges from the records is a portrait of social invisibility, a person existing in a building of many people but known to none in a way that would have prevented tragedy. This case raises a different kind of dark secret than the first. It is not a trail of pings or a cryptic final call. It is the accumulation of small administrative decisions and communal blind spots that, when aligned, allow a life to go unaccounted for. The cross-section here is not high-tech forensic limits. It is bureaucracy and human neglect. And like the first case, the result is a family left with questions and a public forced to reckon with how systems that should protect citizens can fail in quiet procedural ways. We pause here to note that some of the precise spellings and dates in the public filings around this case vary among sources. When records diverge, we label specifics as indefinito rather than guess. This caution is not obstruction. It is fidelity to the families and to the truth. Errors of detail risk turning grief into spectacle. Our aim is to show the contours of the mystery without pinning speculation as fact. As with the German case, the human impact is immediate and enduring. Families of the elderly, children, nieces, nephews, carried the burden of not knowing whether neglect or foul play was at work. The building's community had to live with the ache of hindsight. Could someone have intervened sooner? Could a routine check have prevented the years of silence? These are the questions that linger longer than investigative reports. the quotidian what-ifs that do not feed courtrooms but do shape lives. Between these two stories, a pattern begins to emerge. In the first, technology and an incomplete trail of signals create points of intrigue that never coalesce into proof. In the second, social infrastructure and administrative routine create gaps so large that a human presence can be lost in plain sight. Both cases reveal how small anomalies, an odd phone ping, a paid utility bill, acquire outsized meaning when lives hang in the balance. They are indices of systems that, in different ways, fail those they should protect. Next, we cross an ocean and a generation to a wooded picnic ground in Montana, where a child's disappearance would catalyze a search on a scale large and desperate enough to become a national story. There, the facts are rawer in a different way. The absence of a little girl from a public gathering, the pulverizing uncertainty of a parent's plea, and, later, letters that claimed intimate knowledge of what had happened. That case will force us to confront another layer of missing evidence, correspondence that might be a confession, a lie, or something in between. We will examine it with caution, because the stakes, both human and legal, are immense. We pick up on that forest floor, the place where a child vanished and a community's search became a small nation's story. The files identify the missing child as Niall K. Briscoe. The disappearance is recorded in 1983. The scene began as a summer gathering. Families, ham radio enthusiasts, a picnic among the trees. Children ran along trails. Adults tended grills and radios. For a few minutes the crowd blurred, the way crowds do, people in motion, attention divided among small responsibilities. Then someone noticed a child was gone. The first hours were frantic. Searchers fanned out along the gentle ridges and creek beds. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers threaded the undergrowth. Official resources joined civilian teams. One report lists thousands, among them volunteers, deputies, forest rangers, sweeping the area where the child had been last seen on a trail. That scale was partly a reflection of the clear, terrifying fact that a child can be taken from a public place in a moment. It was also a testament to the determination of a small community that refused to accept absence as an ending. Yet the search yielded nothing definitive. No clothing fragments were found in the immediate area, no child's shoe, no signs of a struggle recorded in the files available to us. The geography of the site, dense trees, steep gullies, made some searches difficult and made thorough coverage a challenge. Over the weeks, search maps were layered with reports, last seen points, search grid sectors, witness sightings that could not be corroborated later. Some leads flared with hope. Most cooled into frustration. Then the correspondence began. Months later, a man began sending letters to the family and to investigators. The letters carried grotesque intimacy and a possessive tone. In them, the writer addressed the child directly in a way that blurred confession and boast. Short phrases that would later circulate in media makeshifts, phrases we reproduce only as part of the record, and strictly labeled unverified, claimed possession and affection. Lines like, "I love her and I have her," attributed in files to anonymous missives. Those words, if authentic, suggested a person who saw the child's disappearance as both possession and proof. Investigators treated the correspondence with caution. Some elements contained details about the child's clothing and the picnic site that were not widely published early on. That raised questions. Did the letter writer have knowledge that only an abductor or a close observer could possess, or had those details leaked through local conversations and media? Forensics on paper and ink in 1980s investigations lacked many of the modern capabilities we now expect. Handwriting analysis was performed in some instances. Results were inconclusive or not definitive enough to name a suspect. Phone calls that followed hinted at similar patterns, anonymous tips from payphones and saltbox booths, voices that altered tenor and offered fragments rather than clarity. The letters and calls created a new shape to the investigation. They introduced a possible interlocutor, someone communicating, perhaps testing, perhaps tormenting. In some accounts, the writer made geographic claims about travel routes and places the child had been taken. Tips then traced to sightings in other states, cars pulled over at rest stops, contradictory descriptions of a suspect's vehicle, a man seen with a child who did not match the tiny features of the missing girl. Some of these reports were credible enough to mobilize search resources, others dissolved under scrutiny. Years later, a national television program featured the case, bringing renewed attention and new tips. The media spotlight is double-edged. It can generate leads and keep memory alive. It can also invite hoaxes, sensational claims, and exploiters. With the renewed exposure came a mix of calls, some sincere and detailed, others cruel and false. Investigators had to triage, assessing which leads were actionable, tracing phone locations where possible, and attempting to separate the grain of truth from the ash of rumor. One recurring theme in the correspondence was control. The tone of some letters suggested the writer relished the power of withholding information. In at least one instance, a letter writer identified knowledge that, to some readers, seemed too precise to be coincidence. Yet even those moments did not produce a chain of verification long enough to change the case's legal status. As with so many prolonged mysteries, information arrived in fragments and often in isolation. Too little to move a prosecutorial threshold, too disruptive to the family's ongoing attempt at private grief. The psychological dimension of such letters cannot be overstated. For the family, each new envelope reopened old wounds. Hope and revulsion mingled in equal measure. Hope that the correspondence might lead to rescue or closure. Revulsion at the suggestion that someone could frame pain as a possession, a trophy to flaunt in ink. Years of correspondence can become a second injury, forcing those who mourn to relive the original disappearance with an added layer of humiliation and confusion. We are careful here to separate what records show from the narratives that build around them. The letters themselves are evidence in the sense that they exist. Their claims are not proven. Handwriting and postal traces sometimes placed messages within certain regions, but conclusive attribution to a single author was not established in the public records we reviewed. Where police reports note tracing attempts, they often also note limitations, incomplete postmarks, reused stationery, and the reality that a determined hoaxer can mimic local details after conducting rudimentary research. Another thread in the files concerns the role of the media and folklore in shaping a case's afterlife. Public fascination with missing children tends to ossify around certain images: milk carton portraits, televised appeals, community vigils. Those images keep cases in public memory. They also make them targets for attention seekers. In this case, the interplay between genuine tips and opportunistic calls complicated investigations that already had limited physical evidence to rely on. The emotional fallout reaches beyond immediate grief. Siblings and extended family members carried the weight of unanswered questions through decades of life decisions, relocations, careers in public service or activism, quiet days of avoidance at park trails where memory lingered. Community organizations formed memorial runs and educational events to keep the child's name alive. Small rituals, placing a bouquet at a trailhead on the anniversary, maintaining a page of tips, became forms of collective custody of memory. That maintenance is, in its way, an act of resistance against time, which otherwise erases names and faces. There is also a legal and procedural lesson embedded here. When correspondence becomes a primary source of information, investigators must balance resources between tracing possible perpetrators and following physical leads. Postal forensics in the 1980s had power but also limitations. Phone tracing to payphones could identify a community of use but not necessarily the individual. If a suspect traveled across state lines, jurisdictional friction could slow coordination. In many cold cases that cross decades, investigative continuity is broken by personnel changes, lost files, and differing priorities over time. Each break is an opportunity for important clues to go cold. As with the earlier cases we examined, we must guard against turning speculation into certainty. The letters may have been written by someone with vast and damning knowledge. They may alternatively have been the cruel calculus of an attention seeker or an individual who had overheard details and then embellished them. We can enumerate scenarios without asserting any as the truth. What we can say with confidence is this: the letters altered the shape of the case, redirected investigative energy, and inflicted a second wave of anguish on the family. In that, they function as a kind of dark secret, the deliberate or accidental injection of new, unresolved evidence that keeps a wound open rather than closes it. Across our 3 stories, a pattern settles into view. The student nurse's last 2-word message and strange phone pings, the silent apartment with decades of paid bills, the letters that claimed a stolen childhood. Each is small in itself, but together they show a recurring dynamic. Tiny artifacts of human life, texts, a cross, a bill, a letter, become epicenters. They do not always offer proof. Sometimes they only create questions that cannot be closed. Another connective theme is how institutions can both help and hinder. In Germany, forensic timelines and telecom analyses offered leads but met limits when decomposition removed the possibility of more detailed testing. In Zagreb, municipal procedures and human inattention allowed a life to vanish within the city's administrative machinery. In Montana, investigative reach stretched across agencies and media, grappling with the porousness of borders and the volatility of public attention. These are not moral equivalences. They are differences on a spectrum of systemic vulnerability, but they share a common outcome: lives unsettled and families left to hold the unanswered. We should also note how fragile certainty is when time is involved. Physical evidence decays, memories shift, witnesses move away or pass on, records get archived or lost. In each of the 3 cases we examined, time was an active force, eroding some possibilities, amplifying others. For families, however, time does not simply erode, it institutionalizes grief into rhythms of remembrance. Anniversaries passed quietly, websites kept as memorial repositories, occasional renewed media attention that both comforts and reopens wounds. There is an ethical responsibility in the way we tell such stories. We have chosen to emphasize uncertainty where uncertainty exists. We have avoided naming suspects or offering neat explanations because the record resists that closure. Our purpose is not to create an entertainment of other people's pain. It is to illuminate the thin, often brittle ways that clues persist and sometimes mislead, while insisting that the victims remain at the center of our attention. The missing are not props for suspense. They are human beings whose absence reshapes the lives of those who loved them. What can be done practically in the light of such cases? For investigators, cold case units have become more creative, re-examining old evidence with new DNA methods, digitizing archives to prevent file loss, creating interagency task forces to handle cross-jurisdictional gaps. For communities, mechanisms of welfare checks, improved tenancy oversight, and better coordination among social services can reduce the risk that someone slips from notice, as in the Hedviga case. For families, public resources, both governmental and nonprofit, can offer sustained support that does not depend solely on episodic media attention. None of these measures are magical fixes. They are, however, structural attempts to reduce the chance that small anomalies become permanent, cruel mysteries. Before we close, one more practical note. Where we have used place names or spellings that appeared inconsistently in the public records we reviewed, we have marked them indefinido in our notes and treated them cautiously in this narrative. Production teams and investigators should verify those details before publication or court use. Small errors in names or dates do damage to trust and to the dignity of those involved. We end where we began, with a title that demands attention: The Dark Secrets of Unsolved Missing Persons Cases, and with an understanding of what that darkness is. It is not an occult force. It is the accumulation of tiny failures and strange traces. It is a text message sent from a place that makes no sense, a bill paid by a third party for decades, a letter that taunts a grieving parent. It is also the resilience of families who continue to remember, to seek, and, where possible, to demand accountability. If you have information relevant to any of the cases we discussed, please contact local law enforcement or use verified tip lines. Links to resources and timelines are listed in the description below. If this episode moved you, Consider supporting deeper reporting and cold case research through the membership options on this channel. Your support helps fund transcription, document retrieval, and follow-up that can keep these cases in the light. Above all, remember that behind every detail is a person. Remember them without reducing their lives to a single unanswered moment. We will keep telling these stories with care and restraint, not to sensationalize, but to insist that unresolved absence deserves both memory and the slow, persistent work of investigation. Thank you for listening and for keeping the missing in mind.